Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The sun in Benin City had a way of scorching dignity off the skin. It burned through fabric, chewed through the roofs of Kiki Napeps, and melted the silence off people's tongues. Life in the city moved with a kind of reckless pulse, like a drummer in a hurry. For Mira Okoji, the pace of the city wasn't what broke her. It was the stillness inside her own life that wore her thin. She woke before the roosters. Always before the roosters. The pot of rice from the night before, what was left of it, was heated over low flame while she bathed with cold water fetched the previous evening. She never filled the basin above half. Not because water was scarce, but because it had become habit to reduce herself. She made meals in silence. She dressed in silence. And she walked to the market through streets that hadn't changed in 10 years. Her stall, tucked between Mama Adesawa's vegetable stand and an elderly man who sold nothing but red onions and chewing sticks, was barely larger than the space beneath a stair. She sold pepper, crayfish, and dried okra, things that left hands stinging and your blouse smelling like bush kitchen by noon. Mira didn't mind. She had no room left inside her for complaints. She exchanged greetings with customers like borrowed words, light, necessary, and brief. The other women called her Quiet Mira, though some said it with pity and others with confusion. What they didn't know was that Mira wasn't born quiet. No, she had simply been silenced so many times that she had turned it into a language of her own. Her marriage to Franklin was not arranged, but it might as well have been a transaction. They met at a cousin's wedding in Warri, where Franklin had arrived dressed like a billboard. Flashy suit, borrowed confidence, perfume that arrived 10 seconds before he did. He said all the right things. Mira, then only 19, still wore her hope like jewelry, visible, delicate, and easily stolen. When he courted her, it was with the precision of a hunter. He told her he liked her modesty. He liked that she didn't talk much, that she was wife material. Back then, those words felt like praise. She hadn't known yet that a man who feared a woman's voice would only try to own her silence. When they married, Mira moved into his flat in Upper Suluco Road, a building that had seen better decades. At first, he was decent. Not kind, just decent. Then slowly, like termites chewing the inside of wood, his true character revealed itself. He shouted often and apologized never. He belittled her in front of guests and blamed her when the gas finished. When he stopped working, Mira bore the weight of the home on her shoulders, but even that wasn't enough to earn his respect. He ruled their house like a local chief with no title, expecting praise for doing nothing. The most painful thing wasn't the volume of his voice. It was the way he made her feel invisible even when he was staring right at her. Sometimes when she served his food, he would push the plate aside, glance at her from head to toe, and say, "Is this the best you can do?" as if her existence were a personal offense to him. On that particular Wednesday evening, the sky hung low, heavy with the promise of rain that never arrived. Mira stood near the gate of their compound, holding a small plastic bag with leftovers she intended to give to the neighbor's dog. Franklin was seated on the front porch, legs wide apart, belly rising and falling like an aging drum. He had been drinking Ogogoro again. Mira could smell it on the air like warning. He was staring at her, no, through her, as if trying to locate something she had misplaced in herself. Without rising, without adjusting the tilt of his voice, he said it. The words dropped into the air like hot oil into cold water. "You think you can survive without me, Mira? Let me tell you the truth now. I am your God. You breathe because I let you." His tone wasn't raised. He wasn't angry. That was what made it worse. He meant it, with the certainty of a man who had never been challenged, never been contradicted. She didn't reply. She only nodded slightly and turned away, the plastic bag still in her hand. Inside her, something shifted. It wasn't anger. Mira had known anger. It was something quieter, something dangerous, a silence that had started to vibrate. That night, when she lay beside her younger brother Timothy, now 12 and already taller than she was, she stared at the ceiling and traced the familiar crack that ran from the corner to the center. The fan above them wheezed softly, like it had a chest infection. Timothy, already fast asleep, had his mouth slightly open, dreaming whatever children dream. Mira, however, wasn't dreaming. She was watching the slow dance of her thoughts, unraveling into something new. Mira didn't speak of that sentence to anyone, not to the neighbor who always gave her extra pepper, not to the market women, who sometimes laughed too loudly, not even to Timothy. But it followed her. The words clung to her skin like damp cloth. The idea that someone who had done nothing for her in years, who drained her joy with every breath, believed himself her creator. It was more insulting than the slaps, more violent than the insults. And yet, she knew if she brought it up, he'd only laugh. Or worse, repeat it with pride. So she said nothing. But her silence changed. Where once it had been hollow, now it began to harden. The next morning, when she left for the market, she tied her wrapper a little tighter. She swept the front yard without being asked. She smiled at Mama Adesawa, genuinely, for the first time in months. Something was shifting. Slowly. Like a river that had found a crack in the dam. That day at the market, a woman she barely knew asked, "Mira, you day all right?" And for the first time in a long while, Mira lied. "I day," she said. But her heart knew the truth. She was no longer where she used to be, even if her feet hadn't moved. That evening, while folding her clothes, she found an old Nokia phone tucked in the corner of her colo box. It had belonged to her mother. It didn't ring. It didn't buzz. But as she held it, something bold danced across her skin, like a whisper that had waited too long to be heard. The old Nokia phone was no longer charged, but Mira turned it over in her hands like it was a sacred object. Its rubber casing had cracked in 2 places, and the once white buttons had turned the color of weak pap. She stared at it for a long time, the weight of memory tugging at her chest like a child pulling at their mother's wrapper. It had been her mother's, back when calls were rare and treasured. Before she passed, her mother would clutch the phone like a lifeline, receiving the occasional check-in from her sister who lived in Kaduna or listening to the automated voice announce, "Your balance is low." Mira pressed the power button, even though she knew it wouldn't come on. Still, something about the feel of it in her palm made her feel less alone. That night, she didn't sleep. The ceiling fan groaned on as usual, turning warm air into tired wind, but Myra's mind was elsewhere. She thought about the woman she used to be. The girl who had once climbed trees with boys, who had braided her cousin's hair while humming songs her mother sang. She thought of Angela, her cousin, whom she hadn't seen in years. Angela had left Benin for Abuja just after secondary school, refusing to marry the mechanic who'd been courting her with promises and meat pie. Angela had been wild in a way that Mira used to envy quietly. She remembered how the other girls would say, "That one go see Pepper for city," but Angela had smiled and gone anyway. They hadn't spoken since Mira got married. Not because there was bad blood, but because some silences grow long from neglect, not malice. The next morning, Mira carried the dead phone to a roadside phone repairer near Ikiosa Market. The boy behind the table was chewing Puff Puff and listening to loud Fuji music from his earpiece. He didn't look older than 15, but his hands moved with the confidence of someone who had resurrected more phones than he could count. "Madam, ego costs small," he said without looking up. Mira nodded and waited. 30 minutes later, the phone came alive with a faint blue glow. There were no saved contacts, only a message from an old MTN promo and one blurry photo of her mother smiling through missing teeth. That night, she sat under the flickering bulb in the kitchen and typed Angela's number, which she still remembered from all those years ago. It rang. Once. Twice. She almost ended the call, but then she heard it, Angela's voice, half sleepy, half cautious. "Hello." Mira couldn't speak at first. Her throat was suddenly filled with stones. But Angela's voice came again, sharper this time. "Hello? Who be this?" Mira whispered her name, almost afraid to be recognized. There was silence. Then a soft gasp. "Mira? Jesus. Is this really you?" For a moment, they both just sat in the sound of their breathing, the years folding into themselves. "Where you day now?" Angela asked. Mira looked around at the peeling paint, the dull walls, the rusting pots. "I'm still in Benin," she said, voice small. "I need to leave." Angela didn't laugh. She didn't ask foolish questions like, "Why now?" or "What didn't happen?" Instead, her voice grew firm. "Say the word. If you want to come, I go find a way." Mira blinked back tears. It had been so long since someone spoke to her like she was someone. Like she was worth saving. They spoke for nearly an hour, whispering like schoolgirls under curfew. Mira told her the truth, but in broken pieces. How Franklin no longer worked, how he insulted her daily, how he once refused to give her money to buy sanitary pads, saying it was her personal problem. Angela didn't flinch. She listened like a woman who had heard worse, like someone who had survived her own fire and carried water for others. "You get anything way fit so?" "Even if not small," Angela asked. Mira thought of her head tie collection, the necklace her mother left behind, and the old kerosene stove she barely used. I fit try, she said. The next day, she sold the necklace to Mama Uche, who always admired it. It fetched barely enough to buy a second-hand travel bag and pay a man to snap and print her passport photo. The woman who helped at the photo booth looked at Mira and asked gently, "You day travel?" Mira nodded. "Eventually," she whispered. In the days that followed, she began to prepare. Quietly, carefully. Franklin didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. He spent more time these days with his friends at the local bar, returning home drunk and muttering about politics. When he spoke, Mira responded like an echo, present but empty. Inside her, however, a storm had begun to gather, quiet but steady. Mira began calling Angela once every 3 days. They never spoke longer than 20 minutes. Airtime was expensive, and Angela was working 2 jobs. But each conversation felt like air being pumped into lungs that had forgotten how to breathe. Angela taught her how to say certain things, how to ask for directions at the bus park, what to carry in her travel bag, how to avoid the fake agents at the terminal who preyed on first-time travelers. Mira took notes. She practiced her responses in the mirror late at night when everyone was asleep. Her brother Timothy had been sent to their aunt's house under the guise of school holiday. It had been a calculated move, one she made 2 months before she ever touched the old phone. She wanted to leave clean. No guilt. No baggage. One Sunday morning, as she boiled yam for breakfast, Franklin walked into the kitchen without warning. He stood for a moment, watching her. Then he said, "You day different these days. You day plan something?" Mira turned and smiled gently, lifting the knife to cut the yam like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. "Nothing, Franklin," she said. "I just day tired small." He grunted, picked a slice of yam from the tray and left. She didn't blink. She didn't shake. The calm in her voice surprised even her. But that was the thing about rebirth. Sometimes it arrives so quietly that even the body doesn't realize it's becoming new again. A week later, Angela sent her a small amount via mobile transfer through a mutual friend. It wasn't much, just enough to buy a bus ticket to Abuja and hold some money for food on the road. Mira packed only the essentials, a wrapper, 2 blouses, 1 photo of her and Timothy taken during the last Salah, and a small bottle of anointing oil her mother used to keep under her pillow. She didn't pack bitterness. She didn't write a note. There was no need. At 4:30 in the morning, she left the house with her travel bag slung over her shoulder and the city still asleep. The streets smelled like charcoal and morning dew. The Kiki boys hadn't started their rounds, and the air felt lighter than it had in years. At the bus park, she bought a ticket to Abuja using a fake name. As the bus pulled out of Benin, she looked back only once. The sky behind her was still dark, but ahead, the horizon was bleeding gold. She didn't know what waited for her in Abuja. She didn't care. What mattered was that for the first time in years, her steps belonged to her. And not once on that journey did she remember the man who had once told her he was her god. Her mind was too full of everything else she was becoming. The first thing that hit Mira when she arrived in Abuja was the air. It was different. Not cleaner, but hungrier. It didn't welcome you. It measured you. The sky here stretched wider than it did in Benin, and the roads were louder, more aggressive, like the city itself had no time to make introductions. At the Jabi Motor Park, hawkers weaved in and out of parked buses, shouting the names of their goods like songs with missing verses. Mira stepped off the bus stiff-legged, the long journey folding her bones like paper. She clutched her small bag with both hands, as if the things inside were more than just clothes, as if they were made of resolve and fear stitched together. Angela was late. Mira didn't have a working phone anymore, and with every minute that passed, a new kind of panic crawled up her throat. But just as the sun began to bite with its full teeth, Angela appeared in the crowd, waving, smiling, her arms wide open like someone who had never forgotten how to embrace. Mira didn't know whether to cry or laugh. They hugged, awkward at first, but then it melted into something real. The years dissolved like sugar in warm tea. Angela had changed. Her skin glowed with the soft shine of someone who had fought her own battles and won some. Her voice had more edge now, a rhythm that carried the echoes of city stress and independence. They entered a Kiki together, the smell of diesel and old seat foam filling their lungs. Mira watched the city blur past in flashes, billboards with women in suits, men in ties, beggars with bowls, street kids chasing nothing. It felt like the whole world had been moving, and she was just now catching up. Angela's flat was a single-room space in a two-story building tucked behind an uncompleted church in Nyanya. The compound had 12 tenants, 2 goats, and one troublesome landlord who shouted more than he collected rent. Mira was given a corner of the room, a worn mattress, and half of the tiny wardrobe. It wasn't much, but it was freedom, and to Mira, it felt like royalty. She washed her clothes by hand, using a broken bucket and Angela's blue bar soap. Every movement was slow, deliberate, like she was learning to live in a new body. Angela introduced her to the salon the very next day, a narrow shop painted in flaking pink, with 5 hairdressers squeezed into too little space. Madame Riri, the owner, was a small woman with loud wrappers and eyes that could slice lies in half. "You sabi braid?" she asked Mira on the first day, arms folded, lips pursed. Mira nodded, even though she hadn't braided anyone's hair in years. But desperation makes confidence out of memory, and hands remember what the heart wants badly enough. She was put on washing duty, at first, scrubbing scalps, rinsing dye, massaging women's heads until her knuckles turned sore. The tips were small, but the lessons were plenty. She watched how the other girls teased customers into laughter, how they used flattery like scissors, cutting through stubbornness with ease. Mira didn't talk much. She didn't need to. Her silence became her strength. Customers began to ask for her by name, not because she was charming, but because her hands were gentle, her attention undivided. Slowly, they began to call her the quiet one with golden fingers. Life didn't suddenly turn bright. This wasn't a story of overnight transformation. Mira struggled. There were days her feet swelled from standing too long. Nights when she lay awake, missing Timothy so much her chest ached like a bruise. The city took more than it gave. Angela was kind, but she was also busy. They rarely ate together. Angela juggled a receptionist job in WUS and freelance makeup gigs on weekends. She returned home tired, sometimes cranky, occasionally distracted. But Mira understood. Kindness didn't require constant attention. It simply required presence, and Angela was present in the ways that mattered. One Saturday afternoon, after Mira completed her first full braid on a customer without supervision, Madame Riri gave her a small bonus, Nigerian Naira 500, and a Fanta. Mira held the money like it was a golden coin. She didn't spend it immediately. That evening, as she walked to the roadside kiosk to buy Gary and milk, she passed a boutique where a mannequin wore a navy blue dress with buttons shaped like raindrops. She paused, smiled slightly, and walked on. She wasn't ready to spend money on beauty yet, but the fact that she had looked, that she had even imagined herself in that dress, meant something was healing. Mira began sending small airtime to her aunt to check on Timothy. She dared not call yet. Her aunt might alert Franklin, but she found ways to stay close from afar. Every week, she set aside a little savings in a paper envelope she kept under her mattress. She called it her becoming fund. 3 months passed, and the salon became less of a battlefield and more of a rhythm. Mira began waking before dawn again, but this time it wasn't to serve, it was to prepare. She pressed her uniforms carefully, greased her scalp, applied lip gloss with a shaky hand and growing certainty. She took pride in being the first to open the shop, the one who knew where every item was kept, who remembered which client liked her hair parted on the left, and who didn't want gossip during appointments. Madame Riri began trusting her with phone bookings. Angela, noticing her discipline, introduced her to a cousin who worked at a corporate events company in Asakoro. They were in need of someone to help organize guest lists and prepare logistics for high-profile ceremonies. Mira almost declined the offer. "I don't fit in that kind of place," she whispered one evening as they ate boiled yam with sauce. Angela looked at her for a long moment, then said, "You don't fit in because you're used to being folded. Try unfolding. Just once." Mira went to the interview in borrowed shoes, her only decent blouse tucked into a skirt that no longer had a zipper but still held together with grace. The office was made of glass and quiet air. She trembled, stumbled through the questions, but something in her honesty caught the attention of the HR woman, a tall lady with white nails and a faint northern accent. "You're green," she said, "but you look like someone who doesn't drop the ball." Mira got the job, part-time, low pay but clean work. When she left the building that day, the Abuja sun hit her face just right. Not too harsh, not too soft. She lifted her face and smiled, not with her lips, but with her bones. Abuja did not become gentler simply because Mira had changed clothes. The roads still roared. The people still hurried. And the city, like a greedy customer at a market stall, always wanted more than you offered. Mira adjusted. She learned to walk with a straight back even when her spine ached from exhaustion. The event's office on Lobito Crescent in was not glamorous at first glance. It shared a building with a travel agency and a stationery shop that smelled like dust and old paper. Myra's desk was by the window, a small rectangle table with a borrowed chair that creaked when she shifted. She was hired as a logistics assistant, but the reality was that she did everything: writing out name tags, printing schedules, checking on vendors, and sometimes sweeping the floor before clients arrived. She didn't complain. She was learning. Everything she touched became a lesson. On her first day, she didn't know how to draft a formal email. The manager, a tall man named Mr. Keen with skin like roasted groundnut and a voice that never rose above a murmur, had watched her struggle for 10 minutes before quietly pulling a chair beside her. "Start with gratitude," he had said. "People forget, but gratitude is the best way to open any conversation." From that moment, Mira took notes, not just with pen and paper but with her eyes and ears. She listened when others spoke, even when they weren't speaking to her. She watched how the receptionists smiled at important clients, and how the decorators spoke in hushed tones when budgets were tight. Her world became a classroom, and she was its quietest, most determined student. Angela noticed the shift in her. Not immediately, but gradually, like how you don't see a seed growing until the day it becomes a tree. One evening, as they sat in their room, eating EBA and egusi from the same bowl, Angela glanced at her and said, "Your eyes are different now. You don't flinch when someone calls your name." Mira blinked, unsure how to respond. It was true. There was less trembling in her fingers now, less weight in her silence. She had begun to move through spaces with a quiet certainty that unsettled even her. Not confidence, no, not yet, but something near it. Mira continued juggling her two lives. By day, she was a logistics assistant with a growing network of contacts. By evening, she still helped at Madame Riri's salon on weekends when they had weddings or bridal bookings. Her savings grew slowly. She kept a small notebook where she recorded every naira. She had even bought herself a small radio, which she listened to before bed. It played gospel in the morning and high life in the evening. Sometimes, during the softest parts of the night, she would hum along with the songs, old ones her mother used to sing while peeling yam. The past didn't haunt her as much anymore. It lingered, yes, but no longer with its teeth bared. Franklin's voice, once a constant echo in her mind, had grown faint, like a radio station losing signal. 3 months into the job, the company landed a government contract to organize a cultural event in Edo State. It was big, bigger than anything they had handled in recent months. The event was to hold in Benin City. Myra's heart flipped when she heard the location, but she said nothing. During a team meeting, while others debated logistics and local suppliers, she sat quietly, scribbling notes. Later, when Mr. Keen asked if she'd be comfortable helping coordinate things on ground in Benin, she paused. 1,000 emotions tried to speak at once. Fear, anger, nostalgia. But she smiled softly and said, "Yes, sir." That night, she told Angela. The reaction was expected. Angela dropped her spoon, stared at her for a long time, and said, "Are you sure you're ready to go back there?" Mira nodded slowly. "I don't feel like I'm running anymore," she said. "I want to walk through that town with my head high. Just once." Angela didn't argue. She only said, "If anything goes wrong, you leave immediately. No second chances." The week leading to the trip felt surreal. Mira packed carefully, her best dress, her neatly ironed office files, and the perfume Angela had bought her on her last birthday. She didn't inform anyone in Benin that she was coming. Not Timothy. Not her aunt. Certainly not Franklin. She wasn't returning as a relative or a wife. She was going back as a professional, someone who had built something from nothing and wanted nothing but to do her job. The flight from Abuja to Benin was only an hour long, but it felt like crossing a lifetime. When the plane landed and Mira stepped onto the tarmac, the air smelled like wet soil and overripe mangoes. It was familiar. Painfully so. The city hadn't changed much. The potholes were still there. The old roundabout still had the broken statue with one missing arm. Her hotel was in GRA, a modest but clean place with a faded carpet and polite staff. Mira settled in, reviewed her schedules, and prepared for the next day's venue inspection. The event was to take place at the Edo Cultural Center, and her job was to meet with the local vendors, ensure permits were in place, and coordinate guest movement. It was work she now understood. She was no longer afraid of phone calls or negotiations. Her voice didn't shake when she introduced herself to security officials and decorators. It was during one of these meetings that a government liaison, a soft-spoken woman named Mrs. Omereg, looked at Myra's surname on the file and asked casually, "Are you related to Franklin Okoji? Used to work at the council office?" Myra smiled politely and said, "Used to. But I haven't heard from him in a long time." The woman nodded, unimpressed, and moved on to the next question. That was all Myra needed. That moment, casual, dismissive, ordinary, told her everything. Franklin no longer controlled the narrative. He was no longer a shadow wrapped around her name. She was just Myra. Full stop. That night, she looked out her hotel window, watching the city lights flicker like restless dreams, and whispered to herself, "I am here on purpose." Benin didn't roar like a buja, it murmured. Its mornings were thick with the smell of firewood and the soft clatter of street brooms sweeping yesterday's dust off aging compounds. Myra had forgotten how the city breathed in slow rhythm, like an old man at peace with his own heartbeat. The Edo Cultural Center had been transformed into a lively ground of tents and canopies, with dancers rehearsing beneath the hot sun and food vendors setting up stainless pots that caught the light like mirrors. Myra walked through the venue with a clipboard in hand and a Bluetooth earpiece tucked into her left ear. She no longer looked like the girl who used to measure salt with fear. She gave instructions with calm authority, not trying to impress anyone, only trying to get things done right. The other staff, mostly hired locally, began to respect her not because of her voice, but because of her consistency. She was the one who came first and left last. The one who noticed when a stage drape was uneven, or a name was misspelled on the VIP list. People began to look at her like someone who belonged. The city that once swallowed her now had to hold space for her presence. And yet, beneath all the noise and movement, Myra knew she hadn't faced the last weight still hanging over her, Franklin. She didn't want a confrontation. She didn't want closure. What she wanted was for him to see her as she had become, and for it to mean nothing to her. That, to Myra, was freedom. It wasn't until the third day of preparations that Myra's name began to travel beyond work boundaries. The local radio station aired a segment on the upcoming cultural event, listing members of the organizing team, and Myra's name was mentioned briefly, mispronounced but unmistakable. The news spread like wind carrying loose cloth. Old classmates, market neighbors, and distant relatives began to whisper. Some called her aunt to confirm. Others simply speculated. A few still thought she was in Abuja selling snacks. But it was Franklin who heard it by accident. He had gone to a friend's shop to borrow a DVD, and found himself sitting through the radio show while sipping warm Guinness. When the broadcaster mentioned Myra Okoji, he thought it was a mistake. He waited. The name came again. And again. And that was when the glass slipped from his hand. The man who used to control her every step now had to sit and listen to her name float across the city like music he couldn't mute. That evening, Franklin stood outside his compound, arms folded, watching motorcycles dart past like mosquitoes. He thought she would return home quietly. Maybe to beg. Maybe to boast. But she never did. Days passed. Then a week. Then the event began. Franklin didn't attend. He claimed it was government nonsense, and that he had better things to do. But his friend Jude went. Jude came back with photos and stories. "She's changed," he told Franklin. "She no day even walk like Myra again. That girl carry herself like madam. Na limousine even come pick him." Franklin laughed like it was a joke, but his fingers dug into the arms of his chair. Myra saw none of this. She was too busy. The night before the main event, she was in her hotel room ironing a cream blouse when someone knocked on the door. It was a staff runner with a parcel. Inside was an envelope and a small card. The note read, "Congratulations. You're doing well. I see you. F." She stared at it for a long time before folding it back into the envelope. She knew the handwriting. The pride in the letter was a performance, a thin veil trying to hide what it really was, desperation. Franklin's ego, she knew, wouldn't allow him to ask questions directly. Instead, he would try to insert himself quietly into the narrative, like a man sneaking into a story already told. Myra didn't reply. The next morning, she got dressed in silence, her earrings glinting like little shields. Outside, the limousine hired by the organizing committee waited. It wasn't her idea. The VIP guests had requested full protocol. But the irony wasn't lost on her. The same woman who once walked barefoot to the market to sell pepper was now stepping into a polished car that smelled like fresh leather and lavender air freshener. As the car turned into Upper Mission Road and approached her old neighborhood, she sat upright, chin slightly lifted, eyes focused. Franklin was outside. Whether by coincidence or calculation, He stood there as the car slowed by traffic. Their eyes met. He was in the same position she last saw him, arms crossed, one foot resting on the gate frame. But this time, it wasn't confidence on his face. It was disbelief, brittle and breaking. She didn't wave. She didn't look away either. She simply blinked, slow and sure, and let the car carry her forward. The ceremony unfolded like a dream choreographed by time itself. Cultural displays swept across the stage in waves, drummers beating like thunder, dancers moving like silk in wind, dignitaries seated beneath white canopies nodding in approval. Mira moved between stations with grace, clipboard in hand, headset buzzing with updates. Cameras flashed. Her name was announced once during the opening speech. "We acknowledge Miss Mira Okoji, Abuja-based events coordinator, whose efforts made this celebration possible." The applause was brief, but to Mira, it stretched like eternity. She didn't cry. She didn't smile too wide. She stood at the edge of the stage, arms by her side, and simply received the moment. After the event, people came up to her. Old faces she'd barely remembered. Aunties who had once told her to endure her marriage. Girls who had mocked her quietness. Men who used to speak only to Franklin when she was beside him. They all came with small talk, wide eyes, and layered admiration. Mira nodded politely, gave brief answers, and excused herself with dignity. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't seeking validation. What she felt was something quieter, heavier, more meaningful: arrival. That evening, as she packed her things, preparing to return to Abuja, she sat on the hotel bed and finally allowed herself a deep breath. The kind of breath that came from a place deeper than lungs. The kind that only freedom makes room for. She picked up her phone, dialed Angela, and when her cousin answered, Mira said, "It's done. I saw him. I didn't feel anything." On the other end of the line, Angela didn't speak immediately. But when she did, it was soft and proud. "That's how you know you've healed," she said. "When the fire doesn't burn anymore." The return to Abuja was not a celebration. It wasn't quiet either. It simply was. Mira arrived at dusk, the city still humming like an engine refusing to sleep. The Kiki ride from the park to Nyanya was dusty as ever, but the ride felt different this time. She stared out at the buildings with windows glowing orange from television light, at the hawkers balancing baskets of gala and peanuts with practiced elegance, at the Okada men laughing into the wind, and she realized she was no longer watching the world go by. She was part of it. Angela was waiting at home, barefoot, in one of her oversized wrapper gowns, with 2 bowls of yam porridge already steaming on the floor. Mira entered without knocking. They didn't hug. They didn't squeal. Angela simply looked up, her expression a question she didn't need to ask. Mira nodded. "He saw me," she said, "and I didn't shrink." Angela smiled, eyes shining like glass about to crack, but holding itself firm. They ate in silence, like sisters who had survived the same war with different scars. That night, Mira slept deeply, for the first time in what felt like years, without dreams or interruptions. She woke up once, only to shift her body and return to sleep as if her bones had found new permission to rest. Morning came slowly, with the birds chirping offbeat and the neighbor's radio playing Fela at a volume just loud enough to feel like a soundtrack. Mira lay on her mattress, watching the cracks in the ceiling, and she realized that she wasn't in a hurry anymore. She had nothing to prove, not even to herself. The office received her return with small congratulations and larger expectations. There was a new event to plan, a private wedding at a senator's estate, and Mr. E. Keene had already penciled Mira in to lead the vendors' coordination. She didn't flinch. She didn't blush. She took the file, opened her notepad, and began to draft the checklist. Her desk had moved closer to the center now. They trusted her more. She had even begun mentoring a younger girl named Anom, who had just joined as an intern. Anom asked too many questions and sometimes got overwhelmed by simple tasks, but Mira was patient with her in a way that surprised even herself. During one lunch break, as they sat under a mango tree behind the office, Anom asked, "How did you learn all this so fast?" Mira thought for a moment before answering. "By being invisible long enough to see everything," she said. It wasn't poetic. It was truth. She had watched people for years, even when no one had looked at her. She had memorized behaviors, absorbed how people listened when they felt heard, and how they shut down when they sensed judgment. These small, quiet learnings were now her weapons. With every successful assignment, Mira's value solidified. Her phone began to buzz with direct inquiries, clients asking for her specifically, but she never let it swell her head. There was still salt in her hands from the years she measured pain in spoons. She kept the humility, not as a mask, but as memory. One afternoon, Mira received a call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, but something nudged her. A voice came through, older, softer than she remembered, like paper worn thin by folding. It was her aunt, the woman who had taken Timothy in. The conversation was brief, formal at first, but the longer they spoke, the more it bent into something resembling warmth. Her aunt didn't mention Franklin. She didn't ask about the marriage. What she said instead was, "Timothy talks about you like you live inside his chest." Mira laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. It came from her stomach and climbed out of her mouth like it had waited too long to be free. Her aunt handed the phone over. Timothy's voice was taller now, deeper, but Mira recognized the joy immediately. "Auntie Mira," he shouted. "I saw you on TV. My teacher even asked if you were my sister." Myra's heart cracked and mended in the same second. "I miss you too much," she said. He spoke quickly, telling her about school, about his new shoes, about how he now washed his own clothes and helped sweep the compound. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "Very proud." After the call ended, Mira sat still for a long while. Not sad, not happy, just full, like someone who had been hungry for years and finally ate enough to feel the body again. She decided to send Timothy a pair of sneakers for his upcoming birthday, even though he hadn't asked. Not as a gesture of obligation, but as a woman who now had enough to give. The next few months rolled by like pages in a slow book. Events came, clients smiled, bills were paid. Mira moved out of Angela's flat after saving enough for her own one-room apartment in Karu. It was small, but painted white and had a working fan that didn't complain. She bought a bed frame from a local carpenter, hung a curtain she sewed herself, and pasted one quote on the wall beside her mirror. "You are not what they did to you." She didn't talk about Franklin anymore, not because she avoided the past, but because he had become irrelevant to her future. Occasionally Angela would tease her, "You fit right book about your life, oh," and Mira would reply, "I'm still writing it." She meant that literally and figuratively. The woman who once stood quietly behind a market stall was now standing inside her own life, no longer waiting for permission to exist. She spent her evenings journaling, cooking meals that tasted like joy, and sometimes just watching the street from her window. One Saturday, she visited a nearby orphanage with Anom, donated hair products, and helped braid little girls' hair. One of them, a girl with wide eyes and tight curls, touched Myra's wrist and asked, "Are you a rich woman?" Mira bent low, looked her in the eyes, and said, "I'm rich in ways that money can't measure." The girl smiled and nodded, as if she understood something even grown-ups often miss. That night, Mira lit a candle on her windowsill, not for prayer but for gratitude. She watched the flame dance, small but steady, and thought, not with fear, but with calm, "This is what it feels like to be whole." No matter how deep the silence or how long the shadow, there is always a path back to your own voice. Don't ever let anyone convince you that you were born to be small. Your life is not a favor from anyone. It is a gift from God. Walk in it. Rise even if your knees shake. Heal quietly if you must, but never stop moving forward. Your past is not your prison. Your power is not in shouting. It's in showing up as your full self, unashamed and unshaken. May you never remain where life tried to leave you. May your heart be louder than the lies that once kept you quiet. May doors open for you even where walls once stood. May every step you take pull you further from pain and closer to purpose. May the people who once looked down on you live to see you rise without hate in your heart. May your peace be deep, your joy be loud, and your life be proof that God never forgets. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.